The Silent Frontier, the life of Lewis Wetzel. The night is calm and still. Imagine lying beneath a wooden roof, the faint scent of pine in the air, the soft creak of timbers settling. Outside, the forest breathes, the leaves move gently, and far in the distance, a river drifts through the mist. The world feels wide and quiet. This is the frontier of Ohio, around the year 1770. The air carries the hush of distance, the rhythm of life untouched by the noise of cities. A small cabin stands between trees, its walls made of oak, its windows covered with oiled paper that lets through a dim, golden glow. Inside, the floor is packed earth, and the fire burns low. The only sound is the faint sigh of the wind. In that quiet world lived a man named Lewis Wetzel, known to some as Death Wind. But forget the name for a moment. Forget the stories told in harsh tones. Think instead of the silence that surrounded him. The same silence that wrapped every cabin and riverbank along the old frontier. He was part of that silence, moving through it like a shadow through leaves. His life was not a tale of glory or fear. It was simply a way of living in a world that asked for stillness, awareness, and patience. He grew up among deep woods and slow streams. His family built their home far from towns where every sound carried meaning. The crack of a branch, the song of a bird, the murmur of wind against bark. From an early age, Lewis learned to listen. He learned that quiet could be stronger than noise, and that stillness could be a kind of protection. The days began with the light of the fire and ended with the glow of sunset on the water. Each movement was careful, deliberate, necessary. As he grew, he spent long hours in the forest. He moved easily through tall grass and moss, his steps soft on the ground. The forest became both teacher and companion. It showed him where to find fresh water, where to walk when the leaves were wet, and how to see the faintest trail of movement in the undergrowth. He came to understand the rhythm of the land, a rhythm that matched the slow beat of the heart. Life on the frontier was not peaceful in the way of comfort, but it was peaceful in its rhythm. People built with what they had. They shared tools, stories, and firelight. The days followed the sun, the nights followed the fire. It was a world of endurance, quiet work, and steady breath. The boundary between safety and danger was thin, but so was the line between solitude and belonging. Lewis lived most of his life moving between these lines. Some saw him as a guardian, others as a wanderer. But perhaps he was simply someone shaped by the place he lived, a man who knew that in wild land, calm was strength and silence was memory. His skills were born from necessity, the ability to move quietly, to read the world around him, to understand what the forest whispered. In time, as settlements grew and paths became roads, that wilderness began to fade. The open land narrowed, and the old ways of living faded with it. Lewis drifted farther west, always following the spaces where the horizon was still open. Wherever he went, the sound of water and wind stayed the same. Steady, low, endless. People remembered him not for the things he took, but for how he moved through the land, cautious, deliberate, unhurried. They said he could disappear among trees and reappear at dusk, calm as shadow. In truth, he belonged to the quiet itself, to the long hours between dusk and dawn when the earth seems to rest. Now, when you close your eyes, you can almost hear that world again. The soft breath of the forest, the slow drift of the river, the distant call of a bird, the faint crackle of a cabin fire, dying to embers. These are the sounds that shaped lives long ago, the same sounds that carry through time, gentle and unchanged. Lewis Wetzel's world was not a story of conflict, but of endurance. It was the story of listening to wind, to water, to the quiet voice of the land. And as you rest tonight, you can imagine that same calm surrounding you, the same steady hush that once filled the frontier. A quiet that holds the whole world, breathing softly like sleep itself. The quiet beginning, child of the frontier. The story begins quietly in a world still covered by forest and river mist. In the year 1763, a boy named Lewis Wetzel was born into a family of settlers. His father, John Wetzel, had come from the old towns of Germany, a man of patient labor and steady rhythm. His mother, Mary Bonnet, carried the calm traditions of her Huguenot ancestors, her hands skilled in the small crafts that made a home feel whole. Their life was built from wood, soil, and time, slow, careful, enduring. When Lewis was 7, in the year 1770, the family gathered their belongings and moved westward. The air grew cooler, the trees taller, the land wider. Their path led them to the meeting of 3 rivers, the place where the Ohio opened its arms to smaller streams. It was still a young world there, unmarked by the noise of towns or the iron of roads. The soil was rich, the water clear, and the horizon stretched so far that it seemed to carry the sky with it. The place belonged to no one in particular, yet to everyone who could listen to it with patience. The Wetzels built their cabin near the bend of the river. The structure rose from oak and pine, its walls thick and simple, its roof laid with bark and pitch to hold back the rain. Around them, the forest was alive, not with danger, but with the deep breathing of nature itself. The wind moved through the branches with a low hum. The light changed softly through the day, from silver in the morning to golden near dusk. At night, the sky was endless and full of slow-moving stars. In those early years, life followed a steady rhythm. Each morning began with the sound of wood being split, the murmur of the river nearby, the scent of damp leaves and smoke. The world felt large, but not empty. Lewis grew among these sounds, the quiet voices of water, the whisper of grass beneath his feet, the creak of wood as the cabin settled with the evening air. His father worked the soil and shaped the fields. His mother tended to the fire and taught the children to move gently around the home. Every task was done with care, for each gesture had meaning. The land itself was both teacher and companion. Beyond the open clearings, the forest spread without end. Oaks stood beside maples and sycamores, their roots thick and intertwined. Ferns and moss covered the ground like soft blankets, and small streams crossed the earth in narrow, glittering lines. Birds moved quietly above the canopy, their wings casting brief shadows that passed like thoughts. For a child, it was a world of quiet discovery, a place where even silence seemed to have texture and shape. The people who lived along the river learned to read the seasons through the land. Spring came with the sound of melting frost and the pale green of new shoots. Summer brought long afternoons filled with insects and distant thunder. Autumn turned the hills to gold, the air cool and sharp. Winter wrapped the woods in stillness. The Wetzels accepted each change as part of the rhythm that guided their lives. There was no rush, no hurry. Work was steady and patient. In those years, the families who moved westward carried with them only what they could manage: a few tools, some seed, a musket, a Bible, or a keepsake from home. Beyond the mountains of the east, the new lands opened like a quiet sea of grass and forest. Yet it was not an empty wilderness. For generations, others had walked those paths, followed the same rivers, built their lives from the same earth. To them, the woods were home, a living place of memory and balance. The settlers who crossed the Appalachian Range did not always understand that balance. To them, the land was space to build and to begin again. The rivers looked like roads and the forests seemed endless. They built cabins near clearings, cut timber for fields, and watched the smoke of their chimneys rise against the pale sky. Slowly, their small farms spread along the riverbanks, each one a flicker of light against the vast green. Lewis was too young to remember the long journey west, but he would carry its quietness all his life. His childhood was shaped by that mixture of work and stillness, long days spent helping his father in the fields, quiet evenings by the fire, listening to stories told in low voices. The air smelled of pine and grain, of soil turned after rain. When night fell, the family gathered close. Outside, the world rested. Inside, the glow of the hearth filled the walls with gentle warmth. In that time, the idea of home was simple and strong. It was not made of stone or luxury, but of repetition. The same chores, the same routines, the same sense of belonging to the land. Each nail in the wood, each pot on the fire, was part of the family's rhythm. It was a way of living that asked for patience and rewarded quiet strength. Beyond their small settlement, the wilderness stretched endlessly. Deer moved softly through the undergrowth, and the rivers carried the reflection of clouds across long miles. There were no clocks here, no walls of sound. Time unfolded through movement, a falling leaf, a drifting branch, the slow cooling of embers. For the people who lived there, to survive meant to listen, to the weather, to the ground, to the moods of the land itself. The Wetzel's home stood at the edge of that still world, where the known met the unknown. The air carried a kind of clarity, an awareness of distance, of how small and yet connected every life was. Lewis, even as a child, seemed to sense it. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to the rhythm of the place. He learned early how to notice what others might miss. A faint track in the soil, the bend of a reed near the water, the subtle change of wind before rain. These were not lessons taught by words, but by the landscape itself. As years passed, more families followed the same trails, building cabins, clearing fields, and shaping a community from the woods. The sound of axes and laughter began to echo faintly between the trees. Smoke from hearths rose gently above the valleys. Yet, even with more people arriving, the feeling of vastness remained. The land was generous but quiet. It asked for care, and in return, it offered endurance. By the time Lewis grew older, the world around him had already begun to shift. The open frontier was slowly becoming a lived space, a place where people worked, rested, and watched the seasons pass in their familiar cycles. But the essence of his early life never changed, a cabin of wood and light, a family bound by effort and silence, a landscape that spoke through wind and water. In that stillness, the shape of his world was formed. Wide, slow, steady. It was a world built not on noise or conquest, but on rhythm, patience, and the quiet connection between human hands and the living land. And though the years would carry him far from that first cabin by the river, the memory of its calm would remain, like the sound of a stream moving gently through the trees. The Cabin by Wheeling Creek. The land along Wheeling Creek was quiet, its waters moving softly beneath the early mist. There, among the tall trees and long grasses, stood the Wetzel family's cabin, a small structure built from timber and patience. The ground around it was worn smooth by daily steps, the scent of earth and smoke drifting through the air. When evening came, the cabin seemed to breathe with the forest. The sound of insects filled the dusk, and the light from the hearth glowed faintly through the cracks of the wall, as if the night itself were listening. Inside, the floor was made of packed earth, cool and firm beneath bare feet. The walls rose unevenly, their heavy beams bound together with clay and moss. Every surface spoke of use, the marks of tools, the soft wear of hands, the quiet pattern of time. The small window, covered with a thin sheet of oiled paper, allowed a dim, golden light to pass through, softening everything it touched. Nothing in the room was unnecessary. A wooden table, a few stools, the rough frame of a bed stuffed with straw. All simple, all placed with care. Each night, this cabin became the center of the family's world. The fire burned low, its warmth wrapping around them as the forest darkened outside. The children spoke little, their voices blended with the crackle of wood and the faint rustle of wind along the roof. Beyond the door, the sound of the creek continued, steady and calm. It was a rhythm they came to know by heart. The breathing of the land, the quiet turning of hours. When morning came, the first light slipped through the paper window like water. The air was cool and damp. John Wetzel, the father, would rise before the others, his steps careful on the packed floor. His first task was to stir the ashes of the hearth, coaxing a flame from what remained of the night's fire. The scent of smoke filled the small room once more, thin and familiar. Outside, dew clung to the grass, and a thin fog rested over the creek. Soon the sounds of the day began, the slow chopping of wood, the creak of the door, the quiet murmur of tools being lifted and set down. Every motion had purpose. The rhythm of work began before the sun fully rose, not with rush or demand, but with calm repetition. The splitting of logs, the turning of earth, the careful checking of the musket that hung by the door. These were not gestures of fear, but of habit. The land required readiness. Morning always came, whether one wished it or not, and the family met it with quiet steadiness. For the children, including young Lewis, each day was a lesson not of leisure, but of endurance. There were no fields for play, no idle hours to pass in dreams. Instead, the forest became their teacher, the cabin their classroom. They learned to gather kindling from the dry places beneath the trees, to tell the hour by the length of shadows, to know which berries could be eaten and which should be left untouched. The rhythm of life itself was their education, patient, repetitive, and deeply grounded in observation. Lewis grew up surrounded by this quiet discipline. His hands became sure, his steps light. The tools of the household, the axe, the flint, the musket, were not symbols of conflict, but instruments of daily living. Each object was treated with respect, cleaned, repaired, and passed carefully from hand to hand. The mornings were filled with work, mending, carving, lifting, tending to the animals, watching the sky for signs of change. Evenings brought rest, but not idleness. Around the fire, the family repaired tools or polished the barrel of a gun, their gestures slow and methodical. The world outside their cabin was wide and full of movement, yet their life within remained contained and measured. Through the seasons, the tasks changed, but the rhythm stayed the same. Spring meant clearing brush and planting. Summer meant tending crops and gathering. Autumn was for storing grain and mending roofs. Winter was for carving, patching, and waiting. The pattern of these actions shaped the boy more surely than any words could. As Lewis grew older, his senses became finely tuned to the world around him. He could tell the difference between the whisper of wind through leaves and the step of an animal in the brush. He could follow the path of the creek by sound alone. When he worked, he did so with focus, his movements quiet, his attention steady. Each small act carried weight. The life of the frontier demanded awareness, and awareness came through calm repetition. What others might have called hardship, the Wetzels called life. The forest did not offer luxury, but it gave rhythm and purpose. The mornings began with work, the afternoons with patience, the nights with rest. In such a place, children learned not how to play, but how to continue. Each lesson was absorbed through doing, how to strike flint to spark, how to balance water on a wooden bucket, how to steady one's breath before the sound of distant thunder. This environment, quiet yet exacting, shaped Lewis into someone of uncommon focus. It was not through command or fear, but through constant example, through the slow repetition of care, through the measured pace of necessity. The forest became part of him, and he moved within it as naturally as one moves within thought. The quiet strength of his upbringing would remain with him all his life, like the low hum of the creek that never ceased outside his door. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, the family often sat by the fading fire. The air inside the cabin was heavy with warmth and the scent of wood smoke. Outside, the world was dark, save for the faint shimmer of moonlight on the creek. Sometimes the wind brushed the walls, making a soft sound like breathing. The moments passed without haste. The stars drifted above the clearing. The cabin, the forest, the family, all seemed to rest within the same slow rhythm. It was in this setting that Lewis grew from boy to youth, learning through silence, through repetition, through the quiet patience of frontier life. Each morning reminded him that time moved forward no matter how gently one wished to hold it. Each evening reminded him that rest was simply another form of work, the work of renewal. The cabin by Wheeling Creek remained constant through the years, small, sturdy, and still. Its walls kept the memory of every fire lit, every morning begun, every quiet hour between dusk and dawn. In its stillness, one could feel the pulse of a life built not on noise or struggle, but on steady endurance. And in that enduring calm, Lewis Wetzel found the quiet foundation that shaped the rest of his days. Learning to live and change. In the quiet years of his youth, the forest was both a teacher and a home to Lewis Wetzel. By the time he was 10, he had already learned what many grown men struggled to master. His hands were small, yet steady, his steps light on the damp ground. He knew how to hold a rifle, how to load it with care, and how to listen for the smallest sound between the trees. None of this was learned for sport or adventure. It was simply what life required. The woods demanded awareness, and awareness began with stillness. Each morning, the mist along Wheeling Creek drifted slowly through the air. The wet grass shimmered beneath the pale sun, and the earth smelled of soil and water. Lewis often followed his father into the forest, watching how the older man moved, not quickly, but quietly, each step placed where it would not break a twig. His father's voice, low and calm, carried lessons shaped by the land itself. "A rifle," he said once, "is only as good as the hands that guide it. Powder and shot do not grow on trees." It was a simple truth, spoken without weight, but Lewis understood it deeply. Every tool had its place, and every movement had purpose. Nothing was wasted, not strength, not time, not even a sound. The boy learned to care for his weapon as one would care for a piece of wood or a small fire, with patience, precision, and respect. The forest around their home stretched far and wide, a mix of oak, maple, and hickory. Between the trees, small paths wound through moss and fern, and sunlight broke through the canopy in thin, golden beams. Lewis spent long hours moving through that space, watching for signs of life, the print of a hoof in damp soil, the trace of feathers in the grass, the quiet curve of a broken twig. These were not games, but daily lessons. To move silently was to belong. To observe carefully was to remain safe. By the age of 14, he had grown lean and capable. His days were spent tending the small fields near the creek and keeping watch over the crops with his younger brother Jacob. The air that spring was soft, filled with the scent of young corn and river mist. From their small rise above the water, the view stretched across green hills and low forest edges. Everything felt steady, wrapped in the rhythm of routine, the kind that came from living close to the land. One quiet afternoon, the light of the sun filtered through the edge of the forest. The sound of the creek moved lazily through the air. Lewis and Jacob worked side by side, checking the young stalks. Then, in a moment almost too small to notice, a faint gleam appeared near the tree line, a shimmer of silver, brief as breath. Lewis paused, his eyes narrowing toward that distant glint. It was the reflection of light on polished metal, something man-made in a place where everything else was natural. The moment stretched thin, suspended in silence. Then came a sharp crack, the sound of powder meeting spark. Lewis felt a sudden force against his chest. The air trembled. The sound rolled away into the forest, leaving behind only stillness. When he opened his eyes, the world had shifted into a slower rhythm. He could hear the wind in the grass, the creek moving calmly below, the faint echo of a voice somewhere behind him. He tried to breathe and found that he could, though it came shallow and careful. Jacob's voice was near, calm and steady, urging him to stay awake. Together they were found by a small group of men moving along the wood's edge, and Lewis, dazed and weak, was lifted and carried beneath the tall trees. For days afterward, his memories drifted between waking and sleep. The journey through the forest seemed endless, each sound distant, each step blending into the rhythm of his breath. The men spoke in low tones, guiding him through streams, over roots, along trails where the canopy turned the world green and gold. The forest, once familiar, now felt vast and endless. Yet through it all, Lewis remained calm. There was no panic, no sharp fear, only awareness. He studied the way the men moved, how they chose the higher ground, how they paused before crossing an open space. Even while weakened, he noticed details, the shape of the trees, the bend of the river, the direction of the wind. The same lessons his father had taught him, to observe, to stay quiet, to endure, carried him through the long days beneath the forest's shade. When they rested, the night settled over the camp like a blanket. The sounds of the world returned in layers, the whisper of leaves, the far call of an owl, the slow beat of water against stone. Lewis listened to all of it. It was the language he had always known, a rhythm of continuity. Even in hardship, he was surrounded by what was familiar: earth, air, and the slow pulse of life. In time, his strength returned. Each morning brought clearer light. Each step grew steadier. The long passage through the wilderness became less of a trial and more of a quiet understanding. He had moved from the safety of the cabin to the heart of the forest and learned that stillness was a form of endurance. The land did not rush, it simply waited, so he waited with it. When at last he returned to his family, the days along the creek resumed their calm rhythm. The fields ripened under the sun, the cabin stood steady, and the sound of chopping wood filled the air once more. But something within Lewis had changed. His movements were slower, more deliberate. His eyes searched the horizon, not with fear, but with awareness. From that season onward, his life carried a new kind of quiet, not born from ease, but from understanding. The lessons of those days stayed with him, that every morning comes whether one is ready or not, that calmness is strength, and that patience is the shape of survival. The boy who once followed his father through the trees had grown into someone guided by the rhythm of the forest itself. He no longer needed to be told how to move or when to listen. The land spoke through every breeze, through every step across the moss-covered ground. In that still, green world, Lewis learned that change does not come through noise or struggle, but through endurance. The gentle transformation that happens when one lives long enough to hear the forest breathe. Crossing the quiet river. The night was wide and silent. The air above the forest hung heavy with mist, and the sound of the river moved softly in the dark, a slow, steady current that carried the reflection of stars. Beneath that calm surface, two young figures waited. Lewis Wetzel and his brother Jacob stood in the quiet shadow of trees, listening to the low rhythm of the water. Around them, the world seemed suspended in stillness, the forest breathing softly in its sleep. Earlier that evening, Lewis had been awake for hours, lying close to the earth, listening. The forest spoke in small sounds, a shift of leaves, the faint crack of wood cooling after the day's heat, the distant murmur of voices that never grew louder. He had learned to separate one sound from another, to know what belonged to the night and what did not. Somewhere close by, the others rested, their small fires dim, their belongings scattered near the riverbank. The camp had grown quiet, the air cool with the scent of moss and smoke. Lewis moved with care, his steps measured and light. Nearby, a pair of moccasins rested beside a log, their leather worn smooth from travel. He reached for them, his fingers brushing against the soft hide. They were light, flexible, and silent against the ground, made for moving without trace. He slipped them on. Each movement was deliberate, steady, unhurried. The forest around him remained calm. A few paces away, a musket leaned against a stump, its barrel catching a faint shimmer of starlight. Lewis picked it up, feeling its familiar weight. It was not his own, but it carried the same balance, the same sense of readiness. The metal was cool beneath his touch, the stock smooth from long use. He checked it quietly, then turned back toward the shadowed edge of the camp, where Jacob waited. Together, the brothers moved through the undergrowth, their steps soundless over the damp leaves. The forest opened slightly as they neared the river. The air grew fresher, touched with the cool breath of moving water. Before them lay the broad expanse of the Ohio, a long, dark mirror stretching toward the opposite shore. The stars reflected faintly on its surface, shifting and trembling with the current. Near the water's edge, an old raft of branches and vines rested where it had been tied to a root. It was rough, but sturdy. The boys knelt beside it, loosening its bindings, their hands moving carefully, as though afraid to disturb the night. The wood creaked softly, but the sound faded quickly into the murmur of the river. Lewis steadied the raft as Jacob stepped onto it. The logs dipped slightly, the surface of the water rippling outward. Then, with slow precision, Lewis pushed off from the bank. The current caught them almost at once, carrying them gently downstream. The forest on the far side seemed to shift closer, its outlines dark and calm against the pale sky. The crossing was quiet. The oar moved in slow, even strokes, the water parting without sound. Around them, fireflies drifted above the surface, their lights flickering in and out like tiny breaths. The river carried the raft with patient strength, its movement deep and certain. The brothers said nothing. They did not need to. Every motion, every small sound belonged to the same rhythm, the quiet labor of moving forward. The air grew colder near the center of the river. The mist thickened, curling above the surface in silver-gray strands. Each drop of water that touched their hands felt cool and clean. The night was vast, yet not lonely. Beneath the stars, the world seemed endless, but also gentle, its stillness holding them as securely as any home. Lewis kept his eyes on the opposite bank, where the faint outline of trees rose from the fog. The current guided them toward it. He did not rush nor strain, but let the river do its work. Each moment felt suspended between movement and rest, the world both changing and unchanging at once. At last, the raft touched ground. The sound was soft, like a sigh. The brothers stepped onto the pebbled shore, their feet sinking slightly into the damp earth. The forest here was quieter, its trees spaced wide, their branches heavy with dew. The air carried the scent of river clay and night flowers. They stood still for a moment, listening, the sound of the water behind them fading into distance, replaced by the whisper of leaves above. Lewis rested his hand on the musket, feeling the cool wood beneath his fingers. Around him, the forest seemed to accept their presence. There was no alarm, no rush, only the quiet acknowledgement of two figures who now belonged once again to the vast calm of the land. He turned to Jacob, and together they began walking through the low grass, following the faint path that led toward the hills beyond. The ground beneath their feet was soft. Each step left a light impression that would soon fade with the morning dew. The air shifted slowly from chill to mild, the horizon brightening with the first trace of dawn. The long night was ending, but it left behind a kind of stillness that felt permanent, a silence carried not in fear, but in understanding. For Lewis, this crossing was more than escape. It was the moment when stillness became strength, when the quiet patience of the forest turned into his own way of moving through the world. He had left behind the noise of pursuit, the closeness of fear, and entered into something deeper, calmer. From that night onward, he would no longer see himself as someone being followed, but as someone who knew the path ahead. The river behind them continued to flow, its current carrying the light of dawn across its surface. The forest around them opened gradually, revealing the soft shapes of trees and hills. The world felt new again, washed clean by water and silence. The brothers walked on, their steps slow and even, their breath steady with the rhythm of the morning. In that quiet crossing, something within Lewis shifted. Not in sudden revelation, but in gradual acceptance. The forest, the river, the mist, and the steady pulse of movement had all become part of him. From then on, his life would carry that same calm, the calm of someone who had learned, in the silence of night, how to continue forward without fear, guided only by the sound of water and the certainty of dawn. Top of form, becoming the quiet wind. When Lewis Wetzel returned home, the forest seemed both familiar and changed. The seasons had passed, the fields had grown, and the river still moved with its calm rhythm. Yet something within him had settled into a deeper kind of stillness. He was no longer just a settler tending his small piece of land. His hands had learned precision, His steps had learned silence, and his eyes had grown accustomed to the distance, to the faint line where the trees met the horizon. He began rebuilding the cabin where his family lived. It was no longer a simple shelter of wood and earth, but a careful structure shaped by experience. The walls were thicker now, the beams fitted tight, the moss between them pressed firmly against the wind. Small openings were carved into the logs, not as decoration, but as windows of awareness. The shutters, made from heavy oak, could be closed against storm or danger alike. Everything about the cabin spoke of readiness, not fear. A quiet, steady attention to the world beyond its walls. At 19, Lewis stood tall with a lean frame shaped by long days of walking the woods. His face carried the calm sharpness of someone who had lived close to the land, and his eyes held the habit of watching the edge of things. The place where the forest begins, where light becomes shadow, where sound turns into silence. Those who met him said his gaze lingered not on people but on horizons, as if he was always listening for the shift of wind among the trees. Life along Wheeling Creek continued in its quiet rhythm. The mornings began with mist rising from the water, and the evenings ended in the orange light of the hearth. Yet for Lewis, each day also carried the subtle discipline of observation. He moved through the woods as if part of it, every branch, every path, familiar beneath his hand. One morning, he set out with a companion named Thomas Mills. The two rode along the forest path toward a nearby stream, their horses moving easily through the soft earth. The forest canopy above filtered the sunlight into a green-gold haze, and the sound of hooves blended with the rustle of leaves. It was a calm day, cool and windless, the kind of day when the world seems to breathe slowly. As they approached the clearing near the water, Lewis noticed something quiet but strange. A horse standing alone, reins hanging loose, as if waiting. Its ears flicked forward, its stance too still. He paused, letting his gaze travel beyond it, across the open ground to the line of trees beyond. The air carried a faint stillness that did not belong to nature's rhythm. Something about the scene felt arranged, deliberate. Thomas, unaware, guided his own horse closer, calling softly. The echo of his voice drifted out and returned faintly through the trees. Then, in a breath, the calm shifted. A sharp sound cracked the still air, the kind that carries distance within it. The forest fell silent again, and the quiet that followed was deep and complete. Lewis turned his horse slightly, guiding it away from the open clearing, not in haste, but with deliberate care. He did not ride back toward the trail. Instead, he moved sideways into the forest, through the low branches and uneven ground. The path was narrow, the air heavy with pine and damp soil. He listened to the movement behind him, the faint rustle of pursuit, far away, yet certain. He kept his pace even, steady. The trees closed around him, their trunks rising like pillars. From the saddle, his hands moved in familiar rhythm, powder, shot, tamp, aim, each motion a quiet continuation of what he had practiced countless times. The rhythm was smooth, almost meditative. Between the sound of his breathing and the steady beat of the horse's hooves, the forest began to feel like part of the same motion, the stillness of preparation balanced against the soft rush of wind. Time passed in slow, even measures. The echo of movement behind him faded, replaced again by the calm of the forest. The trees whispered faintly, the air cooled, and the distant sound of the creek returned. Lewis slowed his horse and let it drink from a shallow pool. The water rippled, clear and bright, carrying reflections of leaves above. He sat quietly, watching how light moved across the surface. Gentle, unbroken, steady. When the moment of unease had passed, he continued through the trees until he reached open ground once more. The landscape stretched wide, the air still and pale in the early afternoon light. Somewhere far behind, the sound of pursuit no longer followed. The forest had absorbed it completely. Lewis returned home that evening, the sun dipping low behind the hills. The cabin waited with its familiar stillness. Smoke curling from the chimney, the sound of the creek nearby. He tended to his horse, checked the wooden shutters and stepped inside. The day, like so many others, ended in quiet reflection. From then on, the people along the river began to speak of him with quiet respect. They said he could move through the woods like wind, unseen, unhurried, but always present. His calmness was mistaken by some for coldness, but those who understood knew better. It was not the calm of distance, but of awareness, the kind that comes from years of listening to the land until it teaches you its rhythm. And so in time, the name Death Wind softened in meaning. It was not a name of fear, but of movement, of a man who traveled between silence and sound, between the known and the unseen, carrying with him the patience of the forest and the still strength of the wind itself. The discipline of readiness. The story of Lewis Wetzel is not only one of survival, but of quiet precision, of a man shaped by long practice and patient skill. His strength did not lie in force alone, but in his ability to see what others did not, to prepare before moments required it, and to move with the calm steadiness of someone who trusted his own discipline more than luck. From an early age, he learned that awareness was as vital as strength. The forest around his home was his teacher. Each sound, each shift of wind, each mark on the soil offered a lesson in timing and patience. He understood that the world rarely warned twice. To live well on the frontier meant to be ready for the day before it came. Lewis began his quiet training when he was barely 14. The rifle was not a symbol of aggression, but of focus. Each morning he would rise before dawn, when the fog still touched the fields and the birds had not yet called. He would walk to the clearing where the ground was soft and the air still, and there he practiced. The routine was slow, repetitive, and precise. Draw the powder, set the flint, load the ball, raise the weapon, fire, reload. Again and again, he would move until his motions became memory. Then he added movement. He learned to reload while walking, then while moving faster, until even the rhythm of his steps became part of his skill. At first, his hands trembled, the powder spilled, the flint misfired. But he continued. The edge of his thumb toughened, his fingers learned to find each piece in the dark. There were days when the work cut his palms and left marks along his wrists, but still he practiced. The repetition itself became a form of calm. It was no longer about what might happen, but about the steady comfort of readiness. Those who watched him from a distance might have seen intensity, a young man shaped by tension and purpose. But to Lewis it was something quieter. It was a way to build order within uncertainty. He did not rush nor chase perfection. He simply continued, as if his movements were part of the forest's own rhythm, the slow repetition of waves against a shore or the turning of leaves in wind. His practice was not about mastery for its own sake, but about understanding the weight of each action. A tool, his father had once said, is only as sure as the hand that holds it. Lewis took that truth into his daily work. Each skill he built was an answer to a simple thought. that one day it might be needed. "Use it today," he would murmur softly, "for someday you will." Through years of repetition, he reached a level of control that few could match. He could feel the balance of the rifle, even in darkness, sense the change of air before a storm, know the distance of a sound before hearing its echo. It was not magic or instinct, but the quiet memory of countless mornings spent in steady motion. His life became a pattern of preparation. The cabin was maintained with the same care as his tools. The shutters were checked, the walls reinforced, the pathways cleared of brush. Each habit was small, but each held purpose. It was not fear that drove him, but discipline. The slow understanding that peace, too, requires work. To those who knew him, Lewis seemed distant, a man set apart by his focus, yet his calm presence carried a kind of reassurance. He did not boast, did not hurry, did not speak of what he had learned. He simply lived by quiet rules, the kind that kept the world steady even when it seemed uncertain. In truth, his was an extreme example of what it means to prepare for the unseen. The cost was not in effort, but in solitude. A life built on readiness can leave little room for ease. The forest became both companion and reflection, vast, patient, and demanding. Its quiet persistence shaped him, just as his practice shaped his days. Over time, his movements softened. The once sharp precision became fluid, effortless. To watch him work was to see balance itself, a rhythm that required no thought, no command. He had become part of what he practiced. His readiness was not tension, but calm, not reaction, but harmony. When the sun set over the Ohio hills and the forest turned blue and silver beneath the fading light, Lewis would rest by the cabin wall. His hands, rough from long use, lay still across his knees. Around him, the sounds of evening, the rustle of grass, the low song of the river blended into the quiet hum of a life lived in patience. His path showed that skill is not only the act of doing, but the art of knowing when to be still. Preparation, in its truest form, is not a burden. It is a rhythm, a gentle habit of attention, a steady breath that keeps one in tune with the turning of the world. Lewis Wetzel embodied that rhythm. His discipline was his way of listening to time, and his readiness the quiet shape of peace. Between the guardian and the hunter. The frontier was a place of quiet tension, not in the noise of conflict, but in the space between two ways of living. The land stretched wide and calm, its forests deep, its rivers steady, and yet within that calm was the constant need for awareness. For those who settled near the edge of the wilderness, life was shaped by preparation, by listening, by the balance between safety and respect for the land around them. Lewis Wetzel, by then a man of quiet purpose, became known among the settlers as someone who understood this balance. His days were filled with small acts of readiness. Repairing a wall, checking a musket, walking the edge of the woods to read the signs left by the night. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words carried the weight of calm instruction. He taught others what he had learned through long years in the forest, how to recognize a change in the air, how to move silently when the world around seemed still, and how to see what was not immediately visible. His lessons were simple and direct. If the signs of movement appeared near the tree line, a bent branch, a print too fresh to be old, he told them not to wait. The frontier, he would say, rewards the cautious but not the hesitant. He urged the settlers to prepare, to strengthen their cabins with solid beams, to build shutters thick enough to hold back the wind and the rain. He helped them dig shallow trenches and set up warning lines using bells and strings that would sound softly if disturbed. These were not acts of aggression but of awareness. For Lewis, preparation was a form of calm, a way to bring order to uncertainty. To watch over one's home was to respect its place in the world. To walk the perimeter of the clearing each evening was to understand the rhythm of the forest that surrounded it. The settlers listened. They watched as he worked, his movements steady and methodical. To them, he became a figure of quiet protection, a man who had seen much and carried his knowledge without pride. When he spoke of vigilance, they heard reassurance. When he moved through the trees, they saw confidence. To many, he was a symbol of endurance, someone who embodied the strength they hoped to find within themselves. But beyond the settlements, among the people who had lived on the land long before, his presence carried another meaning. To them, Lewis was not a guardian, but a shadow, a figure who moved with the precision of one who studied every trail, every sound, every sign. His carefulness, his skill, his silence, all the qualities that made him trusted among the settlers, also made him known as a hunter. In their eyes, he belonged to the forest's quiet edge, a boundary between understanding and intrusion. This contrast shaped the rest of his life. Between the cabins and the trees, between the cultivated fields and the untouched wild, Lewis stood as a quiet line. To one world he offered protection, to the other he represented pursuit. Yet within himself the difference was less clear. His actions came not from anger or conquest, but from habit. The deep instinct to maintain balance where life was fragile. When he walked through the settlements at dusk, his steps left no mark on the dust. He would stop by a family's home, check the beams of a fence, or examine the edge of a roof. His presence, though wordless, carried comfort. And yet, when he disappeared into the forest, his movements seemed to dissolve into the air. There he belonged entirely to the silence, the soft shifting of leaves, the faint scent of pine, the distant call of a bird. Some among the settlers whispered that he lived too close to danger, that his ways were too sharp, too precise. He walks too near the edge, one man once said, but others understood that the edge was where he had always lived, where his skill had meaning. Lewis would only reply quietly, "The land has its rhythm. It does not hesitate." Through the seasons, this duality followed him. In spring, when the rivers ran full and the fields were sown, he helped build cabins and guide families to safety. In summer, when the air grew heavy and the forest thickened, he walked its shaded paths, reading the signs of change in the leaves. Autumn brought long days of labor and the scent of smoke. Winter brought the hush of snow when even footsteps vanished before they were seen. To the settlers, Lewis remained a quiet guardian, a man of calm, steady presence who had learned to turn vigilance into peace. To the people of the forest, he was a figure of movement, one who understood their world too closely, who read the trails as if they were written for him. Between these two understandings, Lewis lived as both protector and wanderer, shaped by the same stillness that defined the land itself. In the end, what mattered most was not what others called him, but how he carried himself within that silence. The forest, impartial and enduring, made no judgment. It simply continued as it always had, vast, patient, and alive with unseen motion. Lewis too became part of that continuity, the quiet watcher between two worlds whose strength was neither in conquest nor retreat, but in the calm balance of awareness. Each evening, when the last light faded across the horizon, he would return to his small cabin, The creek would murmur softly beside it, and the trees would stand motionless in the dusk. The shutters would close, the fire would dim, and the forest outside would settle once again into its gentle rhythm. The same rhythm that guided Lewis Wetzel's life, between the guardian and the hunter, between stillness and motion, between the known and the unseen. The edge of survival. As the years passed, Lewis Wetzel began to live more fully within the quiet rhythm of the wilderness. The world of cabins and fields, of conversations and small gatherings, began to fade behind him, replaced by the steady company of wind, river, and leaf. He had not chosen this separation directly. It had grown around him quietly, as moss grows over stone. What had once been a simple act of protection had become a way of being, not shaped by choice, but by necessity. In the beginning, he had been like any other man of the frontier, building, mending, tending to what life required. But over time, his attention shifted toward the unseen, toward the edge of movement, toward the faintest change in the forest's voice. He had become less a man among people and more a part of the landscape itself. The forest had trained him to listen and to act, and in doing so, it had drawn him into its own, still exacting logic. Lewis could no longer remain simply a friend or neighbor. The skills that once served to protect had turned into something sharper, quieter. He had become a kind of instrument, a being shaped entirely by the need to endure. His hands no longer belonged to rest, but to constant readiness. He had learned to move without sound, to watch without being seen, to understand the rhythm of breath and space as though the forest itself had lent him its patience. One quiet morning, this transformation revealed itself in a single act of calm precision. Lewis had tracked a small group of men through the trees, following signs left barely visible, a disturbed patch of moss, a faint print in the mud, the way a branch had been bent back against its natural curve. He moved with care, keeping to the shadows, his steps merging with the sound of the wind through grass. At last, he came upon a low ridge where the forest opened into a clearing of pale light. Beyond it, a cave rested between stones, its entrance half hidden by vines. From within came the soft crackle of a small fire and the occasional murmur of voices. The scene was quiet, balanced between movement and stillness. Lewis waited at the edge of the clearing, listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath. He reached for a small reed in the grass and pressed it lightly between his fingers. Then, with practiced ease, he shaped a sound, the soft, rhythmic call of a grouse, a bird common to those woods. The tone was gentle, almost melodic, drifting naturally through the air. To anyone nearby, it was an ordinary sound, part of the forest's morning language. After a moment, one of the men within the cave stirred, curious. A few more quiet calls followed, spaced as a real bird might call across the hills. Slowly, a figure stepped out into the clearing, scanning the trees. Lewis remained still, his breathing steady, his body blending with the shadows. When the man moved farther into the open, Lewis adjusted his position slightly, his motions smooth and soundless. What followed was not rush or struggle, only the completion of a practiced rhythm, carried out with the same calm as any other task of survival. When the forest returned to silence, Lewis remained for a while longer, his attention fixed on the way the wind moved through the clearing. He felt no triumph or release, only the familiar awareness that the land had its own quiet order. The moment had passed, and the forest resumed its slow breathing. For Lewis, this act was not born of anger but of necessity. In the borderlands of the late 18th century, The line between protection and pursuit was narrow and often unseen. Each choice was shaped by the world's demands: the need to keep one's people safe, the need to remain vigilant, the need to survive another season in the still, ungoverned wild. Over time, that balance shifted. What began as defense became habit. Habit became instinct. The settlers saw in him a figure of security, someone who carried the weight of the forest's knowledge. Yet to those who had long lived upon the same land, he appeared as something else entirely, a quiet, tireless presence, a shadow along the trees. Between these two visions, Lewis moved, belonging fully to neither. As seasons passed, his connection to ordinary life thinned. He spoke less, traveled more, and spent long hours along the creeks and ridges, moving with the changing light. His sense of purpose remained, but it was no longer tied to others. He had become the continuation of the forest's motion, precise, enduring, without pause. At night, when he returned to his small cabin, the fire would burn low, the air faint with wood smoke. He would sit near the door, the musket resting beside him, his eyes on the window, where the light of the moon fell through the paper pane. The sounds outside, the water, the wind, the slow rustling of leaves, blended into something familiar and constant. In time, Lewis's life became a study in stillness. The world he once defended had changed, but his rhythm did not. The border had moved, the settlements had grown, yet he remained at the quiet edge, a man defined not by conflict, but by the quiet persistence of vigilance. The difference between guarding and hunting, between watching and acting, had faded into the same calm line. He had chosen the world behind the rifle, the place of observation and preparation, and in doing so, he had drifted beyond the world of ordinary living. But within that distance, there was a kind of peace, a steady silence that belonged entirely to the land itself. The forest, the river, and the wind had shaped him, and in return, he had learned to move as they did, with patience, with precision, and without haste. The quiet price of a legend. By the late 1780s, the frontier had begun to change. The once open forests were now threaded with paths, and the quiet edges of the Ohio River had grown busier with trade and talk. Lewis Wetzel, known to many settlers simply as the Wind, still moved through that landscape with his same careful rhythm. Yet the world around him no longer followed the calm order he had once known. In 1788, Lewis joined the army under General Josiah Harmar. The decision was practical. The frontier was no longer only a place of survival. It had become part of the growing territory of a new nation where law and command began to take the place of instinct and solitude. But Lewis had lived too long by his own discipline, too long in the quiet self-governance of the forest. The rigid structure of military life, its rules, its signals, its dependence on orders, felt foreign to him. He preferred movement that came from understanding the land, not from command. The men respected his skill. He could travel through the woods faster than any scout, move without trace, and read the smallest sign of disturbance in the earth. Yet his silence set him apart. Where others worked in lines and formations, Lewis worked in patterns of wind and shadow. He listened to the world around him, not always to the orders above him. One afternoon, the army encampment waited by the river. A delegation had arrived, among them a respected native leader known among the soldiers as George Washington, who had come to speak of a peace agreement. The air was heavy with stillness. Men moved slowly through the camp, their uniforms catching the light of late day. The sound of water carried across the plain. Lewis watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. To him, words written on paper did not hold the same certainty as the land itself. Promises could fade, but the patterns of the forest, the river, and the seasons never lied. While others spoke of truce and treaty, he listened to the faint hum of wind moving through the grass. Then, in a moment that would echo quietly through his life, the stillness broke. A single report, the crack of powder against air, carried across the field. The voices fell silent. The meeting ended before it began. In the confusion that followed, Lewis was seen holding his rifle, calm, unmoving, the smoke still thin in the air. Whether he had acted or simply stood in the wrong place at the wrong time, no one could agree. What remained was silence and suspicion. He was taken into custody soon after. The soldiers, unsure of what had happened, followed their orders. Chains were fastened around his wrists and he was kept in a small room near the river, guarded and watched. He spoke little. When asked why he had acted as he did, his voice was quiet. "You cannot protect what you do not understand." The days passed slowly. Outside, the river continued its steady course, the same water he had crossed and followed all his life. The air inside the small space was still and close, filled with the scent of iron and damp wood. Yet even within confinement, Lewis's calm did not break. The world beyond the walls still moved, and he could almost hear it. The soft murmur of wind through grass, the gentle knock of water against stone. One night, under the faint light of the moon, he left his confinement behind. The details of his escape became the substance of quiet stories, how the chains had slipped loose, how he had moved silently through the darkness, how he had reached the water without a sound. He entered the Ohio once more, its cool current wrapping around him. The chains, still half-fastened, glimmered faintly beneath the surface as he swam. The water carried him across, slow but certain, until at last he reached the opposite bank. By morning, the camp discovered only his absence. The forest had taken him back. Efforts to find him continued for days, but the traces vanished into mist and river. Those who searched the woods said the air felt strangely still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. When word reached the settlements, the story grew. Some said he had crossed the river bound in chains and emerged untouched. Others said he had moved with the wind, unseen between the trees. Whatever the truth, the people of the frontier spoke his name with quiet admiration. For them, he represented endurance, the steady strength of one who belonged to the wilderness more than to the world of rules. The army, cautious and weary of the settlers' loyalty to him, chose not to pursue further. In the small cabins along the river, people whispered that no man should try to capture the one they called Death Wind. It was not defiance, but reverence, the kind given to something both distant and familiar, like a storm that passes without harm, but leaves the air changed. Lewis continued to live along the edges of that world. The story of his escape moved faster than he ever did. Wherever he went, people recognized him, not for his face, but for what his name had come to mean. He had become a legend of motion and silence, the living embodiment of the borderlands themselves, part man, part wind, always between. In time, he returned quietly to the hills and rivers that had shaped him. The forest accepted him again without question. He walked beneath the same trees he had known since childhood, his steps light, his gaze steady. The sound of the Ohio carried softly through the distance. The legend of Lewis Wetzel, the Death Wind, would linger long after his path faded from sight. Yet behind the name was not violence or glory, but the calm persistence of one who had lived too close to the wilderness to ever belong fully to anything else. His life had become its own quiet story, a reminder that some spirits move not in triumph, but in the still, unending rhythm of the wind itself. The fading of the frontier. As the frontier grew quieter, the world around Lewis Wetzel began to move in a new direction. The land that had once been wild and without boundary was now marked by roads, laws, and the steady rhythm of settlement. Cabins became towns and the forests gave way to fields. The calm that once belonged to nature was slowly replaced by a different kind of order, the quiet hum of a growing society learning to govern itself. Lewis, who had spent his life in the open spaces between rivers and trees, found himself standing outside that new rhythm. For years, he had been seen as a guardian of the frontier, a man whose vigilance had kept families safe. But as time passed, the qualities that once defined him, his independence, his silence, his habit of acting without command, no longer fit easily within the new world that valued structure and rule. The army and the officials who now governed the frontier sought consistency, not instinct. They wanted laws to hold what had once been held by vigilance. To them, progress meant bringing the wild under order, replacing the quick judgment of individuals with the measured process of councils and courts. For men like Lewis, who had lived by reflex and intuition, this change brought quiet displacement. The same discipline that had once made him an essential protector now made him seem distant. His ways were shaped by the wilderness, by the knowledge of when to move and when to wait. He spoke in the language of caution and readiness, not of politics or compromise. The new authorities, though they respected his past, began to see him as a remnant of another time, a man of instinct in an age turning toward reason. In the towns along the Ohio, people still told his stories. They spoke of the long nights he spent along the ridges, the soundless way he moved through the trees, the calm certainty with which he faced the unknown. But even those stories began to change. What had once been told as legend became memory, softened and distant. Children listened with fascination, while their parents, now living under laws and contracts, spoke more quietly of the man who had once lived by his own rules. Lewis remained much the same. He walked the paths he had always known, visiting the small farms that dotted the edge of the wilderness. He helped repair fences, mended tools, and spoke sparingly. When asked about the changes, he only nodded. His world had always been made of cycles, of seasons, of preparation, of patience. He understood that every order, even one built from wood and stone, would eventually find its own rhythm of stillness. Yet there was a subtle melancholy in how he fit into the world around him. The forests were thinner, the rivers more traveled, and the silence he had once known grew rare. The people he had once protected now lived with a different kind of safety, one built from distance, not closeness. The frontier that had needed him no longer existed in the same way. In this quiet transformation, Lewis became an example of something simple yet universal, that a person's greatest strengths may not always belong to every time. The skills that had once meant survival, awareness, precision, readiness, now seemed out of place in a world seeking stillness without struggle. The calm of the forest had been replaced by the calm of civilization, and the difference between the two was subtle but unyielding. He did not resist the change, he accepted it as part of the natural flow of things. His life had always been guided by adaptation. When storms came, he waited. When paths disappeared, he found others. The frontier too was finding its new path, one that required fewer watchers of the night and more builders of the day. As the seasons turned, Lewis's presence became quieter. He spent more time near the rivers, walking the banks as he had when young. The sound of moving water still brought him calm. The forest that remained still spoke to him, though its voice was softer now, farther away. In the evenings, when the sky turned to amber and the air cooled, he would sit near the cabin he had built long ago. Smoke rose slowly from the hearth, and the sound of insects filled the air. The world around him continued to change, but within that small circle of firelight, time seemed to pause. He understood, perhaps more deeply than others, that change does not erase what came before. It only shifts its place in the story. His way of life had faded, but its rhythm remained. In the stillness of the trees, in the patience of the land, in the quiet courage of those who had learned from him. Lewis Wetzel had once been the symbol of endurance in a world untamed. Now, in a quieter time, he had become a symbol of transition, a reminder that every age, no matter how different, is built upon the one that came before. And though the world no longer called for the hunter or the lone watcher, his calm spirit continued to move through the landscape like the soft wind across the river, steady and without end. Top of form, the river at dawn. It was late in the season when the air along the Ohio River turned cool, carrying the scent of mist and pine. Lewis Wetzel moved quietly through the trees beside a young scout, their steps soundless over damp leaves. They had followed a faint trail for hours, tracking a small group that had crossed the ridges and moved toward the river's edge. Among the prints left in the soft ground was one smaller than the rest. Light, narrow, pressed close to the earth. Lewis studied it in silence, his hand resting on his knee. The edges of the print were fresh. The girl they sought was still near. The forest around them was calm. The wind shifted softly through the branches, and the low sound of the river carried like a heartbeat through the trees. Lewis glanced toward the west, where the sun was fading. He knew the crossing would come soon. The light would leave the land, and the stillness of night would settle over the water. They waited, watching from the shadows. The scout's hand tightened on his musket, ready. But Lewis shook his head, his voice low and steady. "Not now," he whispered. "If we act in the dark, we lose what we're looking for." His words were calm, almost gentle. He knew that patience, not haste, often decided the course of things. The night belonged to quiet observation. So they watched. The camp ahead was faintly visible through the trees, a dim circle of movement, the light of a small fire flickering low. Occasionally, they saw figures pass before it, shapes that shifted with the rhythm of conversation. The girl's voice did not carry, but Lewis could sense her presence in the way one of the men glanced behind, careful, uncertain. The forest deepened into night. The moon rose above the water, its reflection breaking gently across the current. The air grew colder. Lewis and the young man stayed in place, listening to the slow breathing of the land. Hours passed without sound but for the steady rush of the river. Each moment, the fire ahead burned lower until it faded into smoke. Before dawn, the first light of morning spread across the horizon, soft and silver. Lewis touched the scout's shoulder and nodded. It was time. Together they moved down toward the riverbank, the grass wet beneath their feet. The water was cold as they stepped in, quiet ripples following their movements. They pushed a small raft from the reeds and guided it silently into the current. The mist hung thick, blurring the opposite shore. As they crossed, the world seemed to pause. The only sound was the gentle dip of the oar and the low whisper of the water. The forest on the far bank emerged slowly from the fog, its trees dark against the pale light. Lewis guided the raft into the shallows, then motioned for silence. They stepped ashore and moved to higher ground, settling into the cover of brush and stone. From their vantage point, they could see the clearing near the water's edge. Before long, the faint sound of footsteps broke the morning calm. 4 figures appeared, 3 men dressed for the woods and 1 dressed like a settler. They spoke quietly, moving toward the water where they planned to cross. Lewis studied their pattern of movement, his attention steady. He leaned toward the scout and spoke softly. "Take the one in the coat," he said, motioning toward the man who stood apart from the others. "I'll take the nearest." His voice carried no command, only quiet certainty. The scout nodded, adjusting his position among the trees. The air was cool and clear, filled with the faint scent of earth and smoke. When the time came, the sound was brief. 2 sharp cracks close together, and then silence once more. The morning seemed to hold its breath. The river moved on, unhurried, reflecting the pale light of dawn. The remaining figures turned instinctively, uncertain which way to move. Lewis had already begun to reload, his motions smooth and practiced. The forest absorbed the sound of each movement, the press of powder, the slide of ramrod, the click of flint. When he lifted the rifle again, his face remained calm, his breathing even. Afterward, the clearing was quiet once more. The mist continued to rise from the water, wrapping the scene in a soft, colorless veil. The girl appeared near the edge of the trees, stepping slowly toward the open ground. Her movements were cautious, her expression unreadable. The scout lowered his musket and Lewis nodded once, signaling that all was well. The morning grew brighter. Birds began to call from the branches above, their notes breaking the stillness of the dawn. The light touched the tops of the trees, turning the river's surface to gold. Lewis watched the water for a long time, the sound of it steady and familiar. He did not speak. The forest had returned to balance, and that was enough. As they led the girl back toward the far bank, the air felt lighter, touched by the scent of sun-warmed leaves. The raft moved easily across the current. Behind them, the mist began to thin, and the outlines of the opposite shore sharpened in the distance. The world was once again as it had been before the night. Quiet, enduring, unchanged in its rhythm. To Lewis, it was simply another passage through the stillness, another day that began in vigilance and ended in calm. The river continued to move, carrying the memory of what had passed, without judgment, without sound, flowing toward the endless horizon, soft and unbroken beneath the rising light. Top of form, the quiet distance. The sun rose slowly above the Ohio River, spreading soft light through the mist. The forest was still wet with morning dew, and the sound of water moved gently through the air. Lewis Wetzel stood near the riverbank, quiet as the trees around him. The night had passed, and the search had ended. The girl they had followed for so long now sat near the fire, her clothes damp from the crossing, her eyes fixed on the ground. The young scout who had traveled with Lewis watched her from a short distance. He was still breathing hard from the long chase. Around them, the forest returned to its usual rhythm. Birds calling from the branches, the faint hum of insects rising from the grass. The world seemed calm again, as if the night had never happened. After a while, the young man turned to the girl and asked softly, "Is he always like that?" His voice was not curious or afraid, it was quiet, almost uncertain. The girl lifted her gaze toward Lewis. He stood apart, near the trees, cleaning the barrel of his musket with slow, measured movements. His posture was steady, his face unreadable. The morning light caught in his hair, and for a moment he seemed more a part of the landscape than of the people standing beside him. "Yes," the girl said after a pause, her voice low. "He does what he must. He never hesitates." She looked at him for a moment longer, then lowered her eyes again, as if the words themselves carried their own weight. Lewis heard her, though he gave no sign. He set the weapon aside and spoke only once, his tone even and calm. "Hesitation," he said quietly, "is how one loses here." The words hung in the air, simple and without pride. Then he turned back to the task at hand, his movements as precise as before. For the young scout, it was a lesson without explanation. What he had witnessed in Lewis was something far beyond speed or skill. It was the kind of awareness that came from years of living at the edge of uncertainty, a stillness that existed between decision and consequence. The forest had taught him that every movement carried weight, and that stillness could mean survival as much as motion could. In that quiet clearing, the difference between protection and pursuit seemed almost invisible. Lewis had acted to bring someone home, but the method, the discipline, the calm, all of it belonged to the same world he had lived in for so long. A world that did not pause to reflect, but simply moved forward as the river did, slow and continuous. The girl remained by the fire, her shoulders wrapped in a rough blanket. The scout sat beside her, silent. The mist lifted higher, and the first warmth of the day reached them through the branches. Lewis stayed apart, his back to the water, his gaze resting on the opposite shore. There was no celebration, no relief spoken aloud, only the steady quiet of morning. The air smelled of ash and damp soil. A few leaves drifted down from the trees and settled near the edge of the stream. The moment felt suspended, neither beginning nor ending, simply existing in the soft light of dawn. When the time came to leave, Lewis guided them back toward the trail that led inland. The girl walked between them, the young man carrying her small pack. They spoke little. The forest around them grew brighter as the sun rose higher, filling the path with shifting light. Each step seemed to return them to a world that had waited patiently for them to reappear. That evening, when they reached the settlement, people gathered quietly near the cabin where the girl was brought. There were words of thanks, but Lewis remained outside. Through the open window, the light from the fire cast gentle shapes on the walls. Laughter began to fill the space inside, soft, uncertain at first, then warmer. Lewis stood apart near the edge of the clearing. The night was cool, and the wind moved slowly through the tall grass. From where he stood, he could see the river glimmer faintly under the moon. He listened to the quiet sounds of life within the cabin, the voices, the movement, the sound of safety, but he did not step inside. The young scout came out for a moment and saw him there, still as the trees. He thought to speak, but did not. Some distances, he realized, could not be closed by words. Lewis seemed at peace, though apart, a figure who belonged as much to the silence as to the people he had helped. As the night deepened, the sounds of the settlement faded into the calm rhythm of the wilderness once more. The girl slept, the scout rested, and the forest resumed its breath. Lewis remained a while longer before turning toward the woods. The shadows moved gently around him as he walked, his steps unhurried, his presence quiet, as the wind passing through the leaves. In every world, there are those who guard and those who endure. Sometimes they are the same. Lewis Wetzel had lived long enough to become both. A man shaped by patience and necessity, who stood at the quiet distance between what was saved and what was lost. And though he walked alone, the calm he carried was part of the land itself. The unspoken stillness that lingers when the river flows, the forest settles, and dawn returns again. After the frontier. By the turn of the century, the land began to take on a different shape. The wide forests that once stretched without end now grew smaller, their edges marked by surveyors' lines and new fences. Rivers that had once carried only the quiet rhythm of canoes and drifting logs now reflected the shapes of bridges and the faint smoke of small towns. Between 1790 and 1800, the wilderness that had once defined the world of men like Lewis Wetzel slowly gave way to something more measured, a world of boundaries, roads, and laws. Settlements spread where open fields had been, and where paths once disappeared into trees, roads now stretched toward towns and trading posts. The wilderness retreated step by step, replaced by the steady rhythm of commerce and the sound of hammers shaping wood. People spoke more often of progress, of land grants, and of new states forming from what had once been a quiet frontier. The forest still whispered, but their voices grew distant, softened beneath the noise of human order. For Lewis, this change brought a kind of quiet displacement. His life had always belonged to the open spaces, to the sound of wind through branches, and the calm of rivers unbroken by bridges. The land that had shaped him was fading, and the world that replaced it no longer called for his kind of vigilance. The skills that had once kept him alive, tracking, patience, movement without sound, now seemed unnecessary among the lines and structures of the new order. He lingered for a time along the Ohio, where he had spent much of his life. The river was still familiar, though its banks now carried signs of settlement. Small docks, wooden fences, the smoke of cooking fires rising from neatly built homes. At dusk, the water still turned silver beneath the fading light, and the trees along the far bank held their quiet shadow. But even there, the feeling of solitude had changed. It was no longer the wilderness he had once known, but a landscape moving toward permanence. In time, Lewis left the places that had once defined him. He moved southward, following the water through the Mississippi Basin, passing through lands where the wilderness still lingered in patches of untouched forest and quiet bayou. The journey carried him toward Louisiana, a place of wide rivers, deep marshes, and air that shimmered with heat and moisture. To Lewis, it felt like stepping into a slower rhythm of the world, one not yet bound by the lines of maps and the rules of new governments. New Orleans, when he reached it, was a city unlike any he had known. The streets were narrow and uneven, the air thick with the scent of salt and sugar, the voices of many languages rising and falling in the markets. Ships crowded the harbor, their sails furled against the damp wind. It was a place of motion and trade, but also of quiet corners where the sound of footsteps echoed through shaded courtyards. Lewis moved through it as a traveler, not as a man seeking to belong. In that city, he met a man named James Wilkinson, a figure of influence and ambition, known for his dealings across borders and among armies. Wilkinson saw in Lewis not a wanderer, but a man of rare ability. He offered him work, a position that required the kind of skill the city's quiet politics sometimes demanded. The offer was made in confidence in the still air of a shaded room with the scent of tobacco and ink heavy in the space between them. Lewis listened. The words were precise, the meaning clear. Yet as Wilkinson spoke, Lewis's gaze wandered to the open window where the sound of the river moved beyond the walls. When the man finished, Lewis answered in his calm, deliberate way. "I do not work for gold," he said softly, "nor for Spain, nor for you. I've done what I had to for my own people, nothing more." Wilkinson said nothing in return. The silence lingered, unbroken, except for the slow creak of the shutters in the breeze. Lewis rose, nodded once in quiet politeness, and stepped outside into the brightness of the afternoon. The sunlight fell over the narrow street, warming the stone beneath his boots. He walked slowly toward the harbour, where the sound of water was stronger than the noise of the city. From there, the records of his life grew faint. Some said he travelled deeper into the southern territories, following the rivers into places where law and order had not yet reached. Others said he lived for a time near the Gulf, among the lowlands where the air was heavy and the land met the sea in long stretches of grass and still water. Wherever he went, he remained true to his rhythm, moving quietly, living simply, and listening to the world around him with the same patience that had guided him through the forests of his youth. In this final chapter of his wandering, Lewis Wetzel became a man of the in-between, between wilderness and civilization, between past and present. The world he had known was passing, and he too moved with it, neither resisting nor surrendering, only adjusting to its slower pace. His story did not end with conflict, but with distance, the quiet separation of a man who had lived close to the land and chose to remain in its silence, even as the world grew louder around him. And so, as the new century dawned and the frontier turned into memory, Lewis drifted like the wind he was once named for, unseen, unclaimed, yet still part of the landscape, moving softly through the edges of a world that had already begun to forget his kind. The quiet return. In the slow years that followed, Lewis Wetzel drifted farther south, his path tracing the wide rivers and the stillness of the lowlands. The world around him continued to change, its edges shaped by the steady hands of surveyors and settlers. The wilderness he had known, open, untamed, and full of quiet rhythm, had grown smaller, its wild calm replaced by the movement of trade, of ships, and of towns. The life that had once needed men like him now belonged to memory. In Louisiana, the air was thick and warm, the light golden and slow. The city of New Orleans pulsed with distant music and the murmur of voices in many tongues. Lewis lived there for a time, moving between the edges of the city and the soft, misted countryside beyond it. Yet even there, where the wild still touched the marsh and the river flowed unbounded, the sense of belonging remained distant. One evening, after months of quiet living, his wandering came to an abrupt stillness. In the changing tides of politics and power, misunderstandings found him, and Lewis was taken into custody. There were no grand accusations, no loud declarations, only a calm removal from the streets he had walked. The details faded quickly as they always did with him. He spent more than 2 years in confinement. The days there were long but uneventful. The walls were thick, the air often cool and dry, and the world beyond them moved without his notice. Yet even in that stillness, Lewis's mind remained quiet and clear. He rose each morning at first light, as he always had, and moved with the same care and precision that had once guided him through forests and fields. The habit of patience became his companion. The sound of footsteps in the corridor replaced the rustle of leaves. The narrow window replaced the open horizon. He lived as he always had, simply with measured breath and quiet observation. When freedom came, it came without ceremony. One morning the gates opened and the world beyond waited as it always had, vast, indifferent, and full of quiet air. Lewis stepped outside, the sun bright on his face, the scent of salt and earth drifting on the wind. He did not look back. The river still flowed beyond the city, and he followed it north, tracing once again the familiar path that had shaped his life. The journey was slow but steady. When he reached Wheeling, the place of his youth, he found it changed beyond recognition. Where once there had been cabins of rough timber and paths worn by foot, there were now streets of stone, smoke rising from chimneys, and the quiet murmur of a town finding its order. The land had transformed. The riverbank where his family's cabin once stood now carried the sound of carts and voices. The wilderness he had once guarded had been replaced by the soft persistence of settlement. Lewis walked through the town at dusk. The people moved with purpose, carrying baskets and tools, their faces familiar in shape but not in spirit. The world no longer carried the same silence he had once known. The forests had retreated to the horizon, and with them the life he understood. For a moment, he paused by the river and watched the water slip past the dock, carrying reflections of the setting sun. He did not stay. After a few days, he gathered what little he had and began to move again, quietly, without direction, toward the open lands beyond the settled edge. He did not seek home, for home had changed. The roads no longer led to wilderness, but to towns, and the wild that once stretched beyond them had become a memory whispered by the wind. In time, his figure became part of the quiet stories told along the river, not of battle or triumph, but of movement and silence. People said they had seen him walking at dusk, alone but unhurried, his steps steady and his face calm. Others spoke of a man who passed through villages asking little, speaking less, staying only long enough to watch the river and the trees before continuing on. The years turned without his notice, the forests thinned, the rivers grew busier, and the frontier he had once known disappeared into the fabric of a new country. Yet Lewis remained unchanged in his rhythm. He moved as he always had, steady, silent, patient. His story became a reflection of many who had lived by the same code, men whose hands still carried the skill of survival, whose eyes still saw the world in layers of distance and light, but who no longer found a place for those gifts in the growing calm of civilization. He had outlasted the world that once needed him, and now he lived quietly within what remained of its shadow. The cost of endurance had become solitude. Yet within that solitude was a kind of peace, the peace of someone who understood that all things, even purpose, must fade into gentler forms. The rivers that once carried his raft still moved through the valleys. The trees he once passed beneath still whispered in the wind. Though the world no longer belonged to him, he belonged still to the rhythm of its silence. In the end, Lewis Wetzel's life rested between movement and stillness, between belonging and distance. The frontier had closed, but its quiet lingered within him, the quiet of patience, of awareness, and of a man who continued to walk beneath the sky long after his place in history had slipped into the calm flow of time. The quiet weight of legacy. In the years after his passing from the public eye, the name Lewis Wetzel continued to move through the quiet corners of history. His story was told and retold, sometimes in books, sometimes in campfire tales whispered along the Ohio. To many, he became a figure larger than life, a man shaped by the wilderness itself. The storytellers called him the shadow of the frontier, the silent hunter, the wind that passed unseen through the trees. In novels and histories, he appeared as a guardian of the settlers, a man whose patience and precision had saved lives during the restless years of expansion. Writers spoke of his watchful eyes, his skill, his calm determination. In their pages, he stood between two worlds, the one being built by new settlers and the one that was fading back into the forest. To those who admired him, he symbolized endurance, the quiet persistence of a man who survived where few could. Yet behind the stories of valor and survival, there was another side, one spoken of softly, often in the words of those who had lived on the opposite side of his path. Among the Shawnee and other native peoples, the name Lewis Wetzel carried a different tone. To them, he was not a symbol of protection, but of pursuit, a man whose vigilance had gone beyond defense into something colder and more unyielding. They remembered not his patience, but his precision, not his restraint, but his constancy. In the villages that once lined the rivers, the elders spoke of him as part of the land's memory, neither villain nor hero, but something in between. One elder, a Shawnee man whose voice carried the calm weight of time, was said to have spoken of Wetzel in a way that held no anger, only recognition. "Lewis Wetzel," he said, "and our warriors. We were reflections of one another. The tragedy was not that we fought, it was that neither side could imagine another way to live." Those words, simple and measured, revealed a truth that reached beyond conflict. They spoke of two worlds shaped by the same rhythm: survival, vigilance, and the quiet certainty that life on the frontier allowed little else. Both sides had learned the same lessons from the land: to move quietly, to observe closely, to act without hesitation when the moment required. The difference between them was not in their skill or courage, but in the stories told afterward. Over time, as the wilderness faded and the settlements grew, these stories became history. Lewis Wetzel's name appeared in records and novels, often framed as the embodiment of the early frontier spirit. Painters imagined him standing on riverbanks beneath wide skies, his rifle resting against his shoulder, the forest stretching endlessly behind him. The image was serene, even noble. Yet beneath that calm portrayal was the knowledge that his life had been built in a world that no longer existed, a world where peace was not a place, but a brief pause between days of watchfulness. Historians debated who he truly was. Some called him a protector of his people, others said he belonged more to the wilderness than to any nation. But for those who looked more deeply, he represented something quieter, the complex shape of a life caught between two ways of being. His skills, born of necessity, had once kept him alive. Yet when the world around him changed, those same skills became reminders of a time that no longer fit. To walk through the lands where he once lived is to feel both presences, the echo of the man who guarded and the shadow of the man who pursued. The trees along the Ohio still rise where he once walked, their branches shifting in the wind like memory. The rivers still move with the same slow rhythm he would have known, calm, continuous, patient. In their flow lies a trace of all that once was, the silence of endurance, the cost of vigilance, and the quiet balance between necessity and consequence. The legacy of Lewis Wetzel remains a soft echo in that landscape. neither loud nor forgotten. It belongs to the in-between spaces of history, where legend and truth overlap like mist on water. He was not a figure of simple definition, he was both product and reflection of his time, a man who lived entirely by the logic of the frontier, where every movement, every decision was measured by the rhythm of survival. Today, when his name is spoken, it carries with it both admiration and unease. Admiration for his discipline and resilience, and unease for the quiet reminder of what such a life required. He stands as a symbol of transition, a figure caught between wilderness and civilization, between silence and story. In the end, his legacy is less about action than about endurance. It is about what remains when the noise of conflict has long faded. The calm memory of a man shaped by his time, who lived fully within the world that made him, and who, even now, seems to linger in the stillness of the rivers and forests that once knew his name. Top of form. Two reflections of the same man. Across the long, quiet years that followed, the memory of Lewis Wetzel remained divided, like a reflection seen in moving water. To some, he was a figure of protection, a man who stood between the settlers and the unknown, whose vigilance helped small communities endure through uncertain times. To others, he represented something different, the shadow of a violent age, a symbol of how survival and conquest often walked side by side on the early frontier. Among the settlers who had built their homes along the Ohio, his name carried reassurance. They remembered a man who appeared when danger seemed near, who moved through the forest with a stillness that others could not match. They spoke of him in quiet admiration, of his patience, his skill, his devotion to the safety of those who lived along the edge of the wilderness. In their stories, he became the image of endurance, someone who had accepted the burden of watchfulness so that others might rest. His life was proof to them that vigilance could exist without arrogance, that discipline itself was a kind of strength. But among the native peoples whose ancestors had shared that same land, the stories sounded different. To them, Lewis Wetzel was not a guardian, but a pursuer, a man who belonged to the world of the forest in a way that made him part of its danger. He moved as they did, with skill and silence, but his purpose lay elsewhere. They saw in him the reflection of their own warriors, patient, precise, shaped by the same landscape. The tragedy was not in the difference between them, but in how both sides were bound to the same logic of endurance. Each believed he was defending what could not be replaced. Through the passing of time, this tension became part of his legend. Historians, writers, and storytellers looked back at his life and saw two truths resting side by side, each incomplete without the other. In one version, he was the quiet protector, a man of rare steadiness in a time of uncertainty. In the other, he was the embodiment of an age that could not yet see beyond its own survival. Between these two versions, the real Lewis Wetzel seemed to disappear, leaving behind only the quiet suggestion of a man shaped entirely by his environment. The frontier itself had been a place of contrast, both generous and unforgiving. It demanded discipline, but offered isolation. It rewarded awareness, but punished hesitation. Lewis had lived so completely within that rhythm that he became an expression of it. His actions, his silence, his precision, all of it reflected the land that formed him. He did not seek heroism or cruelty. He sought only to exist within the narrow space the wilderness allowed. To those who admired him, his discipline was noble. To those who feared him, it was relentless. both were true. The same qualities that made him a guardian also made him an outsider. He had learned the language of survival so completely that when the world began to change around him, when law replaced instinct and settlement replaced wildness, he could not unlearn it. The edge of life that had defined him no longer existed, yet he carried it within him until the end. This dual image, protector and pursuer, savior and shadow, became the quiet center of his legacy. The stories told about him never agreed, but together they formed a picture of a man whose life could not be neatly explained. He was not fully hero nor villain, not fully conqueror nor victim. He was a man of the borderlands, and like the border itself, he belonged to both sides and to neither. Over time, as the land changed and memory softened, his image settled into something more balanced. He came to represent not conflict, but the endurance of those who lived through it. His story reminded later generations that survival in a hard world required its own kind of grace, one built on patience, not pride. In this way, Lewis Wetzel's legacy continued to rest quietly between admiration and unease. The settlers saw in him the strength that had once protected their beginnings. The descendants of those he opposed saw the reflection of a struggle that had never been simple. Both were right, and both incomplete. What remains of his story is not a single meaning, but a kind of stillness, the calm recognition that every life shaped by hardship carries within it both light and shadow. Lewis Wetzel's name endures not because he was perfect or terrible, but because he was unmistakably human, molded by a world that asked more of him than peace could offer. And so his memory lingers, not in triumph or regret, but in the quiet spaces between, in the slow movement of the river, in the whisper of wind through the trees, in the place where understanding comes not from judgment, but from the simple awareness that some lives are reflections of the world that made them. The quiet lesson of change. In the long stillness of history, the story of Lewis Wetzel remains both admired and uneasy. To many, he was the image of the early frontier, a man who lived with discipline, patience, and unwavering vigilance. His skill in tracking, his silence in movement, his precision in aim, and his ability to reload while running made him a figure of awe in his time. These were not gestures of glory, but of survival, the quiet necessities of a world that allowed little margin for hesitation. To the settlers who built their lives at the edge of the wilderness, he was a guardian, the presence that stood between danger and safety. Yet beneath that admiration lies another truth, one that belongs to the people whose land and way of life was slowly taken away. For them, the same figure symbolized loss, of territory, of safety, of culture. The progress that defined one world erased another, and in that slow turning of history, both endurance and sorrow took root. The story of the frontier was not one of victory alone, it was also one of displacement, of silence left behind where voices once lived. Lewis Wetzel's life, viewed through both of these lenses, becomes a quiet reflection of the frontier itself, full of skill, necessity, and the weight of consequence. His abilities were remarkable: to read the forest like a book, to hear the faintest change in wind or sound, to move as part of the land rather than against it. These were the crafts of survival in a place where every mistake could mean loss. But as the world shifted, as peace replaced constant vigilance and laws replaced instinct, those same crafts began to fade in usefulness. In the calm that followed the age of struggle, men like Wetzel no longer fit easily into the rhythm of the new world. The frontier that had demanded awareness and precision became a landscape of towns and trade where other skills, patience of a different kind, understanding, adaptability mattered more than speed or silence. The talents that had once defined strength now belonged to another time. The world no longer needed men who lived by the forest's rules, and the ones who could not change often found themselves standing apart, looking at a life that had moved on without them. In that way, Lewis Wetzel's story carries a quiet lesson about change. The same instincts that protect us in one moment can become burdens in another. The tools that once shaped survival can, in time, become relics of a world that no longer exists. It is not failure, only the gentle turning of time, where every strength has its season. When we look at the larger picture of America's expansion, the settlers, the native peoples, the forests, the rivers, the endless line between hope and harm, Wetzel becomes a single figure within a vast pattern. Around him, history repeated its rhythm, the taking of land, the drawing of treaties, the breaking of peace, and the return to struggle. Each stage mirrored the one before, and through it all, the land itself remained the silent witness. Wetzel's consistency, his unwavering sense of purpose, his refusal to bend was both his strength and his solitude. He lived by the same code regardless of where he stood. That constancy made him extraordinary in a time of chaos, but it also made him unable to adapt when the world began to soften. His story is not one of failure, but of stillness in a world that demanded motion. The people who remembered him, in books, in stories, in quiet conversation by the river, saw both sides. They spoke of his calm under pressure, of the way he seemed always alert, yet never hurried. But they also spoke of the loneliness that surrounded him in later years, the distance between the man and the world he had once protected. It was as though the wilderness had retreated not only from the land, but also from within him, leaving silence where purpose had once lived. And so his story endures, not only as a memory of the early frontier, but as a reflection on how all lives move through change. The wilderness becomes a town, the fighter becomes a wanderer, the skill becomes a memory. What remains is the quiet truth that adaptation is as vital as endurance. The ability to listen, to adjust, to find peace in transformation is its own kind of strength, one that outlasts even the hardest seasons. In the end, Lewis Wetzel's legacy rests not only in what he did, but in what he reveals. His life reminds us that survival is not simply about holding on, but about knowing when to let the world change around you. His story belongs to both the stillness of the forest and the hum of the growing town, to the space between what was needed once and what will always be needed. The calm patience to live, to learn, and to continue forward with quiet grace. Top of form. The shape of hard places. In the quiet unfolding of time, Lewis Wetzel stands as a figure formed entirely by the landscape that raised him. The frontier was not a place of choice, but of endurance, a world where silence, patience, and quickness were not virtues, but necessities. To live there was to learn the still language of survival, to listen before moving, to see before acting, to think not in words, but in motion. Those who could not adapt vanished from the story. Those who could became its quiet centers. Wetzel belonged to the latter. The hardships of his world did not merely test him, they shaped him, pressed him into the rhythm of the wilderness until he moved as naturally as its wind and water. His skills became legend, to reload a musket while running, to strike without sound, to disappear into the forest as though it had folded him into itself. Yet even skill, no matter how refined, belongs to its time. The gift that once brought survival can fade when the world no longer calls for it. When peace arrived, Wetzel's precision remained, but the need for it did not. The same discipline that once meant life now left him adrift, unneeded in a land that sought order instead of vigilance. In this, his story mirrors a truth that repeats through history. The value of a skill depends not only on mastery, but on knowing when the season for it has passed. Every act of defense carries two faces. From one side, it is protection, the effort to hold on to safety. From the other, it can appear as intrusion, an edge pressed too far. Among the settlers, Wetzel was remembered as a watchman, a guardian of the fragile line between civilization and wilderness. But to the native peoples who shared that land, he was something else entirely. The extension of a force that pushed deeper each year, taking space that could never be given back. The truth of both views rests quietly side by side, like shadows crossing in the evening light. Neither is false, both belong to the same reality. History holds many such figures, people who lived between meanings, who were seen as protectors in one story and pursuers in another. Their legacy depends on where one stands to watch it. For Lewis Wetzel, the contrast was especially sharp. His calm precision, his readiness, his solitude, all were the marks of a man living at the edge of necessity. He was not made for peace because peace had never shaped him. The stillness of the frontier was his only home, and when it vanished beneath the rhythm of towns and roads, so too did the world that understood him. When the fighting ended, the fighter remained. The land grew quieter, but his habits did not. The forest that had once called for his alertness now offered no threat to meet it. In the calm that others celebrated, he found only distance, a soft estrangement from a world that no longer spoke his language. There is a kind of loneliness that comes not from isolation, but from change, when the world moves forward and leaves its guardians behind. That was the solitude Lewis carried, not bitterness, only the quiet awareness that his season had ended. And yet, his presence lingered. His name appeared in stories, in novels, in quiet retellings by the riverbank. Some saw him as the emblem of courage and endurance, others as a reminder of the cost that such endurance demands. Both were right. His legacy is not only a collection of deeds, but a reflection of how we choose to remember. To look at Lewis Wetzel is to look at a mirror, one that shows both strength and consequence, both valor and its shadow. Over time, the meaning of his story shifted, as all meanings do. Each generation saw him differently, a hero, a wanderer, a relic, a caution. The question was never simply whether he was right or wrong, but what his life revealed about the world that made him. The frontier that formed him is gone, but its lesson remains. Hardship creates strength, yet strength alone cannot hold its place when the world softens around it. To endure is one thing, to adapt is another. Perhaps that is what his life ultimately teaches, that survival is not only about skill or courage, but about the ability to change when the landscape does. The frontier ended not with battles, but with stillness, with fences, with laws, and in that new quiet, men like Wetzel became echoes of what once was, not forgotten, but transformed into memory. His story, when told now, feels less like a tale of triumph and more like a reflection, a reminder that even the strongest hands cannot hold on to a world that has moved on. In the end, Lewis Wetzel's legacy rests not in the noise of conflict, but in the soft truth it leaves behind, that every age honors its own kind of endurance, and that to live fully is to know when to act, when to wait, and when to let the changing world pass quietly through your open hands.